Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Earlier this month, the Eras Committee released the candidates for the Classic Baseball ballot for the Hall of Fame. Names like Dick Allen, Dave Parker, and Louis Tiant are probably familiar to most people. But two Negro League candidates, John Donaldson and Vic Harris, are also on the ballot and may have the best cases of them all. But this is nothing new, as Paul D. White's book, Cooperstown's Back Door, details the long and painful history of the fight to get Negro Leaguers into the Hall, one that continues today. The book is fascinating, and our conversation was fantastic. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Paul, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Scott. How are you doing?
You know what? I'm doing all right. I always like to start off with, where does this idea come from?
Yeah, it came actually with some help from the folks at McFarland. I had been working with them in the past on other stuff that never came to fruition. I always kind of wrote about baseball on the side as for fun, and had cooked up a couple of ideas in the past. And this is one that I threw out because I've been getting into Negro Leagues history more. I live in Kansas City, and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is here. And so Buck O'Neill is someone I've met and, been to the museum a few times. And it's, literally the Negro National League was founded here. So it would be a crime for me to be a guy with a history background and baseball interest and not learn more about it. And the more I learned, the more I was like, oh, okay, this was kind of a tortured path. So I pitched it to the McFarland folks, and to their credit, they were like, yeah, great idea. Go ahead. It was originally going to actually be a little bit broader. It was going to not just be focused on the Negro Leagues. It was going to get into more why we haven't honored other folks, Sadaharu O and folks from the Latin American leagues and things like that. But there's just so much more material when it came to the Negro Leagues, plus there's actual traction there. There's a real history of it. They've actually let folks in from the Negro Leagues where they have not from the others. And so it's like, okay, let's narrow that down and not have it become too jumbled and lost for, all the noise. So focused it down to that. And it was a pretty quick process, actually. It was about 6 months of research and then 6 months of writing. And yeah, went pretty quick.
And this is your first book, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Been writing for 20 odd years on baseball things. I've been a member of SABR, since 2001 or something like that. Got into big, heavy Jim Rice should be in the Hall of Fame debates back in the day, and with, Jason Stark at ESPN and stuff. And bless their hearts, they, would cite me and quote me and that kind of thing. But for the most part, it was all just kind of online stuff. And I didn't get into an actual book until this one.
It's fantastic. It's a really important book, and I'm so glad you actually did do it. And I'm also amazed that you did it so quickly. That's amazing. As a writer, that's the dream. That's everything you want right there.
Amazing things can happen when you finally dump out of your insurance career after 30 some odd years, which is what I had been doing. It's like, I got all this free time now. I can actually devote it to something I enjoy instead of counting beans, So
that's fantastic. That's really great. I wanted to go all the way back to the beginning here. I want to go back to the founding of Cooperstown. And it basically sounds like to me from the very beginning, it was set up to be exclusionary. It essentially was the central premise behind it, between the founders, the location, all these kind of things. Can you talk a little bit about the founding of Cooperstown and what that means for the broader perspective here?
Yeah, it was exclusionary while they couched it as being inclusionary. Actually, they tried to make it sound like we want this to be the history of all of baseball. Literally engaging, let's talk to the minor leagues and let's talk to colleges and high schools. They literally brought in the Boy Scouts. Hey, can you get a merit badge for being a baseball player kind of stuff, and did not talk to a single Black person when they were founding the museum about here's what we want to tell the history of the sport. And they were married, of course, to the myth of Abner Doubleday, which is why it's in Cooperstown in the first place. Without getting into the motivations of the Clark family that found it and whether or not they were in any way based on prejudice or race or whatnot, it's very clear that they had financial interests in the town. They were from there, New York City, and then from the Cooperstown area itself. They vacationed there. They had invested enormous amounts of money in resort hotels and so forth. It's a resort area. It's a big, beautiful lake and mountains and so forth. and it was dying in the Depression. And it was also dying because the other main crop in the area was hops, and Prohibition had killed off much of that. And so there was a huge economic struggle. And the founding fathers of the town, sort of, and founding fathers of the Hall of Fame were all like, well, this is perfect. We got the whole Abner Doubleday thing. Let's go ahead and start a museum here. It wasn't even originally going to be a museum. It was going to, let's have an all-star game, and then we'll also have some museum-y kind of thing. And then it was Ford Frick, when they contacted the National League, it was like, hey, well, how about make it a Hall of Fame instead, or in addition to, or whatever. So that's kind of how it all came about. But they all knew it was based on a crock. That everybody knew by then that the Abner Doubleday story wasn't true. That the guy who had invented that story was literally died in an insane asylum after murdering his wife. I mean, it was not true in any way, and they all knew it. And the Hall of Fame now, they'll put the quote unquote Abner Doubleday baseball on display with a plaque that says, yeah, this is all a myth. It's not, it's kind of tucked around a corner. When you go in through their displays, they're like, yeah, we're not real proud of this. We have to show it, and so it was all kind of known to be garbage. But that's what they wanted, and they wanted something the public could grasp. And that's been basically their theme ever since, was we are a tourist attraction. Even though we're a not-for-profit, it brings a lot of people here who will stay in our hotels and eat at our restaurants and spend money here. And right now, the public in 1935 is not all that interested in hearing about the history of black baseball players. So we absolutely need the support of the major leagues, who are not integrated right now. They are prejudiced people who do not want black people to be playing their sport or employed in their sport or doing anything other than maybe selling peanuts at their ballparks. They didn't want to have them. They didn't want to have them in the stands. They were segregated the stands in many cases too. So it's like, all right, to get the artifacts we need, and the cooperation of the players and the cooperation of the owners and executives of Major League Baseball, we have to kind of follow along with that. And that was just a business decision on the part of the Clark family and those who were working for them. And from that perspective, it made sense, unfortunately. They tried to be a going concern. It did not make sense from the perspective of actually telling the history of baseball. Wow. And the saddest part is that one of the first ever black baseball players was from Cooperstown.
So Abner Doubleday basically did everything but invent baseball, more or less.
Correct.
He was fascinating.
Correct. Guy. And to his credit, never once claimed to have invented baseball. The claim did not come from Abner Doubleday.
No, but there is a guy from Cooperstown. Who is Bud Fowler?
Bud Fowler, his real name was John Jackson, actually. But the family name, he switched the name to Fowler because his dad was a barber, and being a barber was actually sort of a respected profession among the black community at the time. It was one of the few things they were allowed to do and have a small business in and whatnot without being prejudiced against, right? And baseball was not. And so his dad, when he found out he was leaving to go be a ball player, he's like, okay, fine, but don't use the family name. And so he changed his name up to Bud Fowler. And he's one of the first ever black baseball players. And he was he went and played in a variety of professional leagues back in the 1870s, and he's very, very good. He's in the Hall of Fame now. They finally got around to electing him, 4 or 5 years ago. I think it was 2020, 21. I think he was in the same class as
he was with Buck O'Neill.
Yeah. And he learned all of his how to play baseball in Cooperstown. He was from the region. They lived in Cooperstown for a long time. And at the time they were starting the Hall of Fame, he was known to be one of the first ever black ball players. And they could have at least included him in the displays and say, hey, look at another tie to the town. They didn't even have to abandon the Abner Doubleday myth if they didn't want to. They could have just added on to it and just really didn't want to have anything to do with that. So, in fact, when they were hunting around looking for artifacts and trying to get people to support it, because they started the Hall of Fame in 35, but they didn't open it until 39. And so in that intervening time, even though they're electing classes of people, there was no ceremonies held or anything like that. They were just, hey, let's try to still put together the building and the displays and whatnot. And they were casting about for support from all these various organizations, and some black organizations and writers from like the Pittsburgh Courier, famous black newspaper and whatnot, were like, hey, we've got all sorts of folks who would love to participate, who would love to send you artifacts or tell the story of black baseball and whatnot. And the founding fathers of the Hall of Fame were like, that's okay. Why don't you go ahead and start your own? They didn't have any interest in it at all. So they certainly weren't going to include the story of Bud Fowler, for, even though there was a direct tie to Cooperstown.
Right? It's right there. It's right there.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, it is not a secret that black baseball players are equal, and in many ways, some of them are clearly better than what you're seeing in the major leagues. Barnstorming is happening at this time. What role does barnstorming play in the relations between blacks and whites, Major League Baseball, Negro leagues? It has a lot more to do than I thought it really did.
It was the primary way in which the myth that black players weren't good enough or didn't have any interest in playing in the major leagues, which was another myth that was floated for a while. It was the primary way to debunk all of that, because the black players were very clearly at least as good as their white counterparts whenever they would play each other. The SABR and other organizations, Seam Heads, Negro Leagues database, an enormous amount of research around this. Any number of researchers have made very clear when they played head-to-head against white teams, they won more often than they lost. All-star teams, regular teams, didn't matter. They beat them. They just beat them more often than they lost, and in spectacular ways often, and to the point where some black players started getting the reputation of being, oh, that's the black Joe DiMaggio, or that's the black Honus Wagner, or whatever. And to Honus Wagner's everlasting credit, when he heard that about Pop Lloyd, John Henry Lloyd, he says, "Oh, I'm honored by the comparison. He's a great baseball player, because he'd seen him play." And that started to get some traction. And it was among the things that made the arguments more and more ridiculous the closer they finally got to actual integration, and whether or not players would be good enough to play from the Negro leagues, would be good enough to be in the white major leagues, the integrated major leagues. Those barnstorming tours is what made it really clear that, oh yeah, they're going to be fine. They're really good players. The fear was one that actually Satchel Paige voiced eventually, which was, if you just take our best players, the ones who shine in these all-star games, in these barnstorming tours and whatnot, you're going to kill the Negro leagues. You're going to skim off the best talent, and all of a sudden what's left in the Negro leagues is going to be a lesser product, a minor league essentially. And that may not be a viable business product unless it's affiliated with the major leagues, which it wasn't, and which, sure enough, it died off.
Yep.
So
pretty quickly,
yeah. So and we'll get into it when we start talking a little bit about John Donaldson, but he was a primary driver in setting up all the barnstorming. He was sort of one of the pioneers around all the barnstorming that was taking place. Black teams by themselves, or black teams playing against local white teams, against white all-star teams, major leaguers and whatnot. It was Donaldson and others who helped sort of establish that as the way that those teams could make money. That's the ways that black ball players could get paid and expose their talents to the world, was through barnstorming. And if not for barnstorming, for instance, we might not have night baseball, or it would have been greatly delayed, because it was that barnstorming model that had been set up that made J.L. Wilkinson, the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, say, we could play 3 games a day if we could play at night, and invented basically a portable light system, right local to here, actually. In Lawrence, Kansas, there's a Haskell Indian Nations University is a Native American university in Lawrence, Kansas, and they had lights on their football stadium. And so he brought the Monarchs there to test it out. Hey, can we practice on your football field at night with lights on, see if my guys can see the ball and whatnot. And as soon as he was like, yep, they can do it, he went and paid for this whole lighting system to be rigged up, and they dragged it along behind their bus and set up in farm fields and played games at night and made more money that way. That's a Negro Leagues invention directly tied to barnstorming. The major leagues didn't have night baseball for another 5 or 6 years.
So slowly but surely, there starts to become some support. Some people become more outspoken about including Negro leaguers. Who are some of these people, and how does that start to get the ball rolling here as we lead up to Satchel Paige's induction?
Yeah, the big catalyst around this was the black media, Wendell Smith and folks at Sam Lacey, with particularly the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, newspapers like that, but also, believe it or not, the communists. The Daily Worker had a baseball beat writer who was very much in favor of integration and was constantly sort of embarrassing publicly Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of baseball. Lester Rodney was his name. And just saying, hey, have you paid attention yet to the fact that these guys can really play, and on and on and on. But the real change that took place was two things. First, World War II, where Black people served in such great numbers, and it became so against regimes that were racist regimes, that was so obvious. It's like, it'd be kind of dumb for us not to let them play here after they just helped us defeat, these group of racist organizations, regimes in Germany and whatnot. So that's kind of unfair and horrible. But also, Kennesaw Mountain Landis died in 1944. And he was just a flat out obstacle. There have been people defend him since and say he never once banned integration, but he also did nothing to support it and stonewalled it at every turn. There's the famous story of Bill Veeck trying to buy the Phillies in 1943, in the middle of the war when most of the white players were gone serving in the military. And he was like, okay, I'll stock it with Negro leaguers who were not as heavily hit because there were military quotas to how many Black people could be in the military. So more Black players, more of the top talented Black players got to stay home. They would work defense jobs or something in support of the war, but they still got to play baseball. Satchel Paige was still around, and Josh Gibson was still around, and Buck Leonard was still around. And he's like, all right, I'll just stock the Phillies with Black players. There's no prohibition, right? Trying to call their bluff. And out of respect for Landis, this is according to Veeck, this is what I intend to do. The Phillies are for sale. I'm going to buy them. This is what I'm going to do. Landis patted him on his head and was like, thank you very much for letting me know, Bill. Appreciate that. And then they sold the team to somebody else. It was like, for, according to Veeck, less money. But that's how, and there's, questions about how true that statement, that story was from Veeck. Veeck was a big kind of, storyteller, and how accurate that was is unknown, but it's not in any way out of character for how Landis had operated, right? Happy Chandler, who replaced him, did not have the same view, which shocked everybody because he'd been the governor of Kentucky. And people just presumed he was going to have the same sort of views. And he did not. He's like, nope, if they could serve and on Iwo Jima, they can play baseball here in America. It's fair. It's that's the fair thing to do. And after some pressure from the media and the new commissioner being like, yeah, this is the right thing to do, Branch Rickey felt more emboldened to say, I'm going to ignore what every other owner wants me to do here, and I'm going to go ahead and sign Jackie Robinson.
Yeah. As far as major league players, one, I didn't realize Bob Feller's involvement in this, who is just
he's a really complicated guy.
He is. I when I was in college, I interviewed him, and he yelled at me. He was all over the place.
Yeah.
But he was involved. But I think most people know very famously Ted Williams.
Yes.
And Ted Williams gets a lot of credit. I think perhaps deservedly so, for making a stand for including these Negro League players. Can you talk a little about Ted Williams and some of the other major leaguers and their thoughts and views on including Negro League players into the Hall of Fame?
Sure. Ted Williams' case, my understanding is that it was largely driven by a pair of things. The first is that he himself was half Mexican. His entire side of his mother's family was from Mexico. And growing up in the United States in San Diego with an Anglo name in Anglo parts of town, but hearing then what was being said about Mexicans, he had sort of a personal connection to racism that was on display, right? And always felt it was wrong. And, personally affected by it. He hid his Mexican background for most of his life. So that was a main driver of some of his feelings around it. And the other one was he just appreciated excellence. He, in all fields, like if you're a great fighter pilot, you're my guy. If you're a great fisherman, you're my guy. If you spent all the time in the world honing your skills to be a great major league player, I don't care. White, black, purple, yellow, it doesn't matter. You deserve to be playing in the top tier of baseball. And if you're Willie Mays, which is the guy he quoted, he cited in his famous Hall of Fame speech that led him into then suggesting that, Negro leaguers should be in the Hall of Fame, then you deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. You can hit more home runs than me, which Mays had just done. He had just passed Williams's home run total at the time of Williams's Hall of Fame induction speech. Then yeah, that's the name of the game. You set goals and you set records, and they're made to be broken. And if it's broken by a black person, tip your cap and honor it the way you would anything else. And the only reason more of these records aren't held by black players is because they weren't given a chance. So that was his motivation behind it. And that was earth-shattering, basically, for the folks who up to that point had just wanted to stick their head in the sand and say, no, this is not right or fair that Negro Leagues representatives should be in the Hall of Fame. There hadn't been anybody except Feller or some news media types and things like that who had made the case. And Feller was wishy-washy on it. He'd gone back and forth, and he was kind of a blowhard. Well, not kind of. He was a full-on blowhard, self-promoter and just a complicated, weird guy. He's so strange. He used to walk around with his projected statistics in his pocket for what he would have had if he hadn't missed years from World War II. It's like, dude, you're in the Hall of Fame. You were a first ballot Hall of Famer. What are you trying to prove here? But he just was kind of strange that way. When he wrote, very famously, he wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post around the time he was coming up to be eligible for the Hall of Fame about what he felt the Hall of Fame's problems were. He said one of them was that, Satchel Paige isn't in it, and Satchel Paige deserves to be in. And that just largely kind of got blown by. People just it didn't resonate in the way that Williams's statement on the steps of the Hall of Fame did, in front of all the leadership of the Hall of Fame. And it was very planned. The Hall of Fame has his speech. The copy, he'd written it out on stationery from the little motor lodge he was staying at nearby by hand. It's 9 pages long. You can still see it online even. You can go online to the Hall of Fame site and see it. And it's written down. It wasn't off the cuff that he threw this out there. He intended to note the Negro Leaguers as being worthy of being in the Hall of Fame. And that's the part that made people kind of go, oh, okay. And some writers start to say, what, Ted might be right here. Boston writers didn't. Boston writers got focused on something completely different.
It's ridiculous, yeah.
But some writers like Dick Young, for instance, who had a very powerful voice because he was the top sports columnist in the most widely read paper in the country, the New York Daily News at the time, started to finally go, okay, yeah, let's start advocating for this. And when Dick Young started advocating for things, he did not stop until he got his way, essentially, right? He's a complicated figure as well. The whole Baseball Writers Association of America is complicated around this because they were segregated. They didn't allow, they integrated the same year that baseball did. They let Wendell Smith in the same year that Jackie Robinson broke in. And even when they did it, that's when they established the 10-year rule. You can't vote for the Hall of Fame until you've been a member of the BBWAA for 10 years. That was instituted when they integrated. So they, right from the get-go of letting black writers be part of their organization, they also were like, but pump the brakes. We're not going to let you vote yet. You got to be around for a decade or so for that. They had, their god, so to speak, J.G. Taylor Spink, the first, president, or one of the first presidents of their organization, and the person after whom they named the Hall of Fame, named the award for journalists, was flat out against integration. He was Landis's biographer, in a very flattering way, and wrote piece after piece in the Sporting News, his family paper that they own, about how integration was a bad idea and the double standards that he would put in place. Oh, look at Bill Veeck signing Satchel Paige when he's 40 some odd years old. That's a joke. It should be. But then other teams had done the exact same thing with older white players, and he hadn't said a word. It was patently obvious. So the writers were part of the problem, and it wasn't until the 60s when you started to see, other than the Lester Rodneys of the world and the black media, the white mainstream Baseball Writers Association of America did not really get behind the notion of letting Negro leaguers into the Hall of Fame until Williams' speech. That was really the catalyst that made mainstream columnists start to kind of come out of the woodwork and go, yeah, that's right. That's that's the right thing to do. And that added to the pressure that finally made the Hall of Fame cave in.
So we finally get to the titular moment here. We start letting players in through essentially the back door, which is something I did not know anything about this. What is Cooperstown's back door?
Yeah, well, that is a quote from Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige was the first Negro leaguer to be elected. That was after a lot of negotiation, essentially, between Bowie Kuhn, who I don't think was a good commissioner, but is kind of a hero in this particular story, because he threw the weight of the commissioner's office behind the campaign to integrate the Hall of Fame. And he and Dick Young, who hated each other, but they were allies in this cause, went to the Hall of Fame leadership, which was Ford Frick at that time. He was chairman of the board, former baseball writer and also former commissioner of baseball, which tells you, again, kind of the incestuous relationship between the writers and baseball and the Hall of Fame. It was all this odd mix, right? And went and said, this is only fair. And they were in the middle of, Summer of Love and all of the social justice movements of the 60s and whatnot. And the time was just ripe, on top of having Ted Williams speak up and so forth. And some writers like Young, very influential writers, finally start to speak up. And so the Hall of Fame was like, all right, we'll let in some. Basically, the idea was we'll put in an all-star team, essentially. Over the next 6, 7, 8 years, we'll put in one player per position, which they still kind of did. But that was the original thing. And we're going to be on one plaque that was a display in a different part of the Hall of Fame, not in the plaque room, not as members. And the first person elected was Satchel Paige. And when the announcement happened that February of 1971, Bowie Kuhn was asked, so is he a member of the Hall of Fame? Is he an actual member of the Hall of Fame? Or is he just going to have a display in the Hall of Fame? And Kuhn honestly answered, well, no, he can't honestly be said to be a member of the Hall of Fame. I know I consider him to be a member of the Hall of Fame, a Hall of Famer. But technically, no, he's not. This was the agreement we got with the Hall of Fame, was that they wouldn't be full members, right? And that went over as well as you would have expected it to in that time period, and pressure in the media, the whole, oh, great, we've got a separate but equal Hall of Fame now. Thanks so much. We just saw civil rights demonstrations put an end to that in the Jim Crow South, and now you're putting it in upstate New York. Thanks. So the Hall of Fame caved in on that, but not before Satchel Paige chimed in and said, I want to go to the Hall of Fame, but I'm not going through the back door. He was not necessarily going to accept it if it was the way that they originally described. And so literally on his birthday, July 7th, I know that because it's my birthday too, he was told, you're going in as a full-blown member of the Hall of Fame. And that kind of broke down that. His plaque is now going to be an individual plaque. And then the succeeding, over the next 6 years, when they put in the other 8 members of the quote unquote all-star team, they all got individual plaques as well. But that's where Cooperstown's back door comes from. The title is because thought he was going through the back door. That was a comment made in column after column. Jim Murray of the LA Times, and his column was syndicated at the time, was printed all across the country. He was like, this is like Jim Crow South. You're making them get their food through the back door. And this backdoor theme became a thing, a running commentary basically in all these things. And Page himself said it. So it was kind of an obvious title. On top of which, the fact that to this day, the Hall of Fame statue of Satchel Paige is outside facing the back door. It's not in the hall, and it's literally facing the back door. There's a photo in the book. I took it, standing behind the Hall of Fame. I came around the corner and was shocked that this is the only statue of Satchel Paige on the grounds of the Hall of Fame, and it's literally facing the back door. I don't think they quite understood that. I don't think they put two and two together when they
There's some optics
placed it
there.
there. Yeah,
Yeah.
it just looks so bad, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So, they put in these Hall of Famers, and it's kind of like, hey, great. We're good now, right?
Right.
We did it. Look at
Sure.
us. Awesome.
Yeah.
The next really kind of major event, and this is also why we started the Lit Journal, is Ken Burns baseball. This is when Buck O'Neil really comes onto the scene. What role did that have for the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, it had an enormous role because after it was the first wave of Negro Leaguers were put in the early 70s, 71 to 77. And at that point, they stopped and they said, that's 9. That's enough. There's one per position, kind of. They kind of squeezed Martin DeHigo into second base to call it an all-star team, but okay. And then they just said, now it's the Veterans Committee. More Negro Leaguers can be put in, but it's up to the Veterans Committee. And there's 3 groups the Veterans Committee can study each year: white players who are no longer eligible for the baseball writers vote, black players, Negro Leaguers who were never eligible for the BBWAA vote, and then everybody else, executives, umpires, managers, you name it, right? And you'd think they were limited to put in 2 people per year from the Veterans Committee. So it's like, okay, you got 3 groups and you can put in 2 per year. Well, every 3 years, each group should have 2 representatives put in if you're doing it in any fair way, right? Well, they went white player, white executive, white player, white executive, white player, white executive for the first 3 years. Finally, Buck O'Neil was named to the Veterans Committee. And the year he was named, they finally put Rube Foster in from the Negro Leagues. But then they went right back to white player, white executive, white player, white. And for the intervening 17, 18 years, from 77 until baseball, the documentary came out in 93, I think it was 93 or 94.
I think it's 4,
94.
Yeah. Either way, yeah.
And they only put 2 people in from the Negro Leagues, Rube Foster in 1980 and Ray Dandridge in 1987. That's it. There were years they left their second spot open rather than put a Negro Leaguer in the Hall of Fame, which is preposterous because at this point, you've only got 11 guys, the original 9 plus Foster and Dandridge, and you still don't have Bullet Joe Rogan and Willie Wells and these crazy good players, all-time great players, not being considered, just not seriously being considered. And even after Roy Campanella was added to the committee and Monty Irvin was added to the committee, they still couldn't get traction with the rest of the committee to get over that hump. So O'Neil played a major role. He was the star, essentially, of the baseball documentary. And Ken Burns was taken by him and promoted him individually. And he started donating to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which was kind of nascent at that point and had not really gotten off the ground. And they'd actually had a version of kind of a Negro Leagues Hall of Fame, Hall of History, they called it, which fell on its face in the early 80s. And they finally tried to open it in Kansas City, which they did, but it didn't really go anywhere. Then baseball came out. And as he did with everybody, Buck O'Neil charmed the pants off of everybody who saw it, right? And people started paying attention to the Negro Leagues again. Within a couple of years, the Hall of Fame said, okay, we'll do mandated Negro Leagues elections for 95, 6, 7, 8, 9. And they did. They started putting in some of those folks. But it took those big catalyst events for the Hall of Fame to start breaking down. It was the civil rights movement in the 60s, coupled with Ted Williams backing it. There's enough public pressure now for us to break from the way we've done it. And then they did it again until baseball came out and like, oh, okay, there's enough public pressure now. There's enough interest from the public for us to go ahead and put additional Negro Leaguers in. And this is a theme that they've had throughout, right from its founding through its existence now. The Hall of Fame caters to the public's perception of what baseball is or has been, rather than just being a true museum. They're not a member of the American Museum Society Association, whatever that organization is that has standards for what museums should be established as and operate like. They're not a member purposefully, right? It's because they have other museums that the Clark family owns in Cooperstown. There's like a farmer's museum and a couple other things. Those are members. they're members of those museum organizations, but not the Hall of Fame. And because they want a little more latitude to conform to public expectations instead of making the public think about it, they'd rather cater to what the public already thinks. And only when they get it really clear in their heads that the public has changed their minds, like because baseball came out in the early 90s, or George Floyd's murder happened and these huge social justice movements came as a result, did the Hall of Fame go, oh, okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and finally react to that and change how we've been. And I know I've just jumped ahead, but
I was gonna, you got there. I was gonna get there. Yeah, I was gonna get there. You got there. Perfect. Hey, that's saved me a question. That's great.
Yeah.
So, in fact, we can bring it all the way up to present day. In fact, all the way up to a week or two ago when the veterans ballot was the candidates released, and there are two Negro Leaguers on there. We have John Donaldson and Vic Harris. Who were they, and are they worthy of the Hall of Fame in your opinion?
John Donaldson was a great, mostly pitcher who played primarily before the founding of organized Negro Leagues. He played a bit after that, but his main career took place in advance of that. So there's not great statistics about him. He was legendary. He toured like crazy, barnstormed. He was like I said before, he's one of the people who established barnstorming as a primary means of Negro Leaguers to A, make money, but also B, show their skills to the world. But while he was doing that and taking basically all comers, I'll pitch against other black teams, I'll pitch against local town teams, I'll pitch against Major League All-Star teams, I don't care. He was racking up ridiculous numbers if you pay attention to that sort of thing. And some of those should be discounted, obviously. They're not recorded very well. They were against spotty competition in many cases. But so like 14 no-hitters and, things like that. It's like, you just you can't really put a lot on that from the perspective of saying, yeah, he's a Hall of Fame player. I think he was a Hall of Fame player, but he was absolutely a Hall of Fame pioneer. So if he's on the ballot as a pitcher / outfielder, he might have trouble getting support. If he's on the ballot as a pioneer, he should absolutely be in the Hall of Fame. He literally is kind of a precursor pioneer to the Negro Leagues themselves, was one of the primary stars of touring, barnstorming Negro baseball, even prior to the actual Negro Leagues. Without him doing that, it's unlikely that there would have been enough interest to even form organized Negro Leagues, let alone have white players want to play against them and make extra money in their offseason and so forth. His role in that is so central to how the Negro Leagues were formed and how the visibility of black players became to the forefront of American society, how white people and major league players and organizers and executives and whatnot could no longer really deny that these guys were great, is largely because of John Donaldson and people like him. So from that perspective, he should absolutely be in the Hall of Fame. Vic Harris was primarily a player. He had a great career as a player, but he's not on the ballot as a player. He's on the ballot as a manager. And as a manager, he should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago, because there are no managers from the Negro Leagues in the Hall of Fame. Not one. There's only people in like Rube Foster who managed, but he's not in as a manager. He's in as a pioneer / executive for founding the Negro National League. There's the Bullet Joe Rogans and so forth who are in as players, and they also happened to manage and were good managers. But that's not why they're in the Hall of Fame. No one's in the Hall of Fame just for being a manager in the Negro Leagues. And there have been 17 managers in the major leagues who won at least 4 pennants. Excuse me, there's 18. 18 managers who won at least 4 pennants. All of them who are eligible to be in the Hall of Fame are in the Hall of Fame, except for Vic Harris, and he won 7. Right now, people say that the highest winning percentage for a manager is held by current Dodger manager Dave Roberts with his 620-something career winning percentage. Vic Harris's winning percentage as manager was 663. I mean, he only won one World Series, but they only played World Series in some of the years that he was the manager of the Homestead Grays. He's so wildly overqualified to be in the Hall of Fame. And this is a gaping hole in the Hall of Fame's resume, so to speak, right? That they don't have anybody as a manager in the Hall of Fame from the Negro Leagues is an embarrassment. And I actually spoke to someone at the Hall of Fame as part of this book, and I raised that exact question. I was like, are you guys intending to push that? Or are you hopeful that the process takes care of itself, or what? And the answer was the second. They kind of hope the process takes care of itself, but they are aware of it, quote unquote. And let's put it this way. My guess is that whatever instructions are given to the voting members of the Eras Committee are going to include that big gaping hole in the representation among managers in the Hall of Fame. And if Vic Harris is not elected, they have to reconsider their process for the Eras Committee voting, because of all the people on the ballot, he's the most qualified. He's easily.
Well, it's interesting because the deck is almost stacked against them here because, the lack of statistics. We talked about they're up against Steve Garvey. They're up against guys who we remember, we know a lot about. Do you think they're going to get in?
I don't think Donaldson's going to get in. I think Vic Harris is. The problem that they have is that, and actually it's funny that you mentioned this because I'm writing about this exact thing. Two of the other people on the ballot are Tommy John and Louis Tiant. And unfortunately, voters are probably going to have to pick which one of those they would want to support, because the voters are limited to 3. They've only allowed to vote on 3 of the 8, which means because there's only 16 voting members, there's only 48 votes cast, and you need 12 to get elected. They can't get more than 4 of these 8 guys in. And that's the narrowest thread the needle scenario, where 4 candidates each exactly get 12 votes. That's the only way you get 4 in. The likelihood is it's far fewer than that, unless there's vote swapping taking place. It's not going to work out that way, right? So it would be odd for them to say, I've only got 3 votes. 2 of them are going to be from pitchers from the exact same time period. No, they're probably going to go, I'll take either Tiant or John. I'll take one of the 2 Negro Leagues representatives, and then I'll pick my favorite hitter, whether it's Garvey or Boyer or Parker or whatever, right? So that's my guess is what they're going to do. And that makes it really hard for both of the Negro Leagues guys to get in. I think between the 2 of them, there's far more support for Harris because of the resume that I just cited, and the fact that all of his resume took place in the organized Negro Leagues. So there are some statistics for it, whereas Donaldson's, unfortunately, are largely before that time period. And it's going to be more difficult for them to kind of grasp his case as well, unfortunately.
Do you have an idea of how many Negro League players you think should be in the Hall of Fame still that are not? Do you have any estimate?
I don't off the top of my head. I could rattle off 10 names probably. Yeah. And, from Rap Dixon to John Donaldson and John Beckwith and on and on. There's probably, I would say, 10 or 12 who have been passed over. What I think and what I propose in the end of the book actually is that the Hall of Fame do one more pass through. What they currently have is there are 3 eras committees of classic baseball, which is everybody who was mostly contributed prior to 1980, and then current baseball or whatever, contemporary baseball, 2 of those, one for players and one for everyone else, managers, umpires, so forth. I think what they should do is take that classic era and have a committee, a special committee again, like they did with the 2 Negro Leagues instances, the first one in the 70s and the second one in 2006, and say, we're going to consider everybody from 1980 or prior, Negro Leagues or white or whatever, all of them, and winnow that down to just the couple dozen guys, whoever they may be, white, black, whatever, put them in kind of en masse like they did in 2006 with the 17 Negro Leagues elections, and then stop considering the era altogether, or only consider it once every decade or something like that, because that's the only way you're going to clear the glut of candidates. Because right now lost amid, right? Bobby Grich couldn't get on this year's ballot, and he's wildly overqualified to be in the Hall of Fame, right? And any number of other outstanding players. Bill Dolan, every time Bill Dolan shows up on the ballot, he gets at least 50% of the vote, and yet they didn't put him back on the ballot this year. Well, why? It doesn't make any sense. Harry Stovey led the league in homers 4 times. He was the all-time homer leader for a long time until it was finally, his record was broken. He got more than half the votes the last time he was on. He couldn't get back on it either. Dave Concepcion got more than half the votes the last time he was on. He couldn't get back on the ballot, and on and on and on, because they're limited to 8 people. And it's the entire history of baseball before 1980. There's lots and lots of people. How do you get it down to 8 guys? It's just super hard. So I think unless they do kind of a reset button exercise where we just kind of clear out the 2-3 dozen people from that era who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame using the current standards that we have. The standards are the current population of Hall of Famers, right? That's what everybody has agreed. They haven't thrown anybody out. So the Hall of Fame has accepted every single person who's been elected by whatever means. So those are the exemplars against whom everybody else should be judged. And if everybody passes some midpoint of what those are, they should be in, basically. And then stop considering them. That group has been looked at over and over and over. They're wildly overrepresented in the Hall compared to more recent eras because they've just been looked at longer. And so they still will pull out Joe Gordon in 2009 and stick him in, and he deserved to be in. That's not a criticism of that election as much as it's why did he been dead for a while? What took so long? And maybe if you do that, you'll have less of these horribly sad cases like Louis Tiant's, where they might very well elect him a month after he died. Well, like Ron Santo a year after he died, like Minnie Minoso, like on and on and on. All of these people who didn't get in until they died. Let's clear that out. Then those folks know I'm not even being looked at for another decade if they don't get in, or they get in. Their families can kind of have some peace of mind. And then more contemporary players can start to get the lion's share of the attention so that the next time we don't have Lou Whitaker just get passed over without anybody paying attention, and it just becomes a more streamlined process. It's fair. It gets everybody up to speed. And the only thing I would argue on top of that is it gives them a chance to reset the distribution of Hall of Famers from that time period so that they are evenly distributed amongst the parties involved. So like right now, even with all the work they've done to honor the Negro Leagues, they still are not equally represented compared to the white major leagues. And I don't mean equal in terms of 50-50. I mean equal in terms of proportion. Once the Negro Leagues were founded, any given year between 1920 and 1948, and possibly beyond if SABR gets their way, there's a couple of additional seasons that they think should be included as major league equivalent seasons. Every year in between there, at least a third of all active major leaguers were in the Negro Leagues, right? But they're nowhere close to being a third of the Hall of Famers from that time period. They're well underrepresented. So fix that in this process, get that up to snuff, so to speak, and then shut it off, call it good. There'll still be a couple people who are borderline who didn't get in. Yes, absolutely. But that border will be much lower. They won't be so obviously egregiously qualified and skipped over like the Vic Harrises of the world. There'll be people who are truly borderline. Some will get in, some won't. That's the definition of borderline. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. Right now, there's some obviously overqualified people who, from Jack Glasscock and Bill Dolan and Vic Harris and so forth and so on, Dick Lundy, all these people who should absolutely be in the Hall of Fame and just can't get any traction in the current system because they're threading a really small needle. So if I had a vote on that committee, Vic Harris would absolutely get my first vote. And then I'd figure out who my other 2 votes were going to be for. Yeah. But unfortunately, they have to kind of play that strategy of how I pass votes around and do I coordinate it with my other committee members to try to figure out, let's not just have it be one guy or not have it be 0, please have it not be 0, Let's try to get in a representative group and start to get through some of this backlog so that we're not considering Steve Garvey every 3 years when he's been passed over literally 20 times.
Well, just wait until all the steroid guys come in here too, and this is going to be a completely lost cause, I think, at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. So winnow it out, get it level set, and then you can kind of focus on the more current, time periods, which gets back to the Hall of Fame's primary interest of conforming to. You still need the public. Mm-hmm. I understand why they do what they do, but right now they're so skewed from the past that until they fix that, they're still going to have to spend some time on it. Like now, they're spending every 3 years, they're spending their Eras Committee time focused on stuff from 45 years ago or earlier. And they're not focused on people who current fans ever watched play, and that it can't be good for the future of the Hall of Fame. I hope they do something along those lines. They've done it in the past. They never quite got it right. So I hope they do it one more time and finally get it right.
People want to read more of your writing. Where can they find that?
I'm on Substack. You can either get to it from www.lostinleftfield.com or pauldwhite.substack.com. Either one goes to the exact same place. I write every day. It's a daily newsletter. Well, every weekday newsletter. It's all focused on baseball history. Friday's always a Friday stuff kind of roundup of topics that happen, and it's all focused on the historical stuff. I will reference modern things that are happening, but usually only if I can pull somebody from the dusty pages of a history book and kind of attach them to it. So like, hey, yeah, Shohei Ohtani's great, but have you ever looked at Bullet Joe Rogan real close? Because he was Shohei Ohtani before Shohei Ohtani. So.
Well, Paul, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Scott. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
That was Paul D. White, author of Cooperstown's Back Door, a history of Negro Leaguers in the Baseball Hall of Fame. To close us out, we have Dave Malone reading his poem from our 17th issue.
I'm Dave Malone, and this is my poem, Minor League Game in Mauldin, South Carolina. The right fielder steps to the plate. Lines of gray hair sneak out of the batter's helmet. Crisscrosses decorate the back of his neck. Jersey too tight around his midriff. The pants are wrong, too. The announcer calls his name, and it crackles and dies in the outfield. I know this guy. He was an expo once. God, that must have been a decade ago. And I remember now he hit 362 after 40 games. Then something happened. What happened? He lost a son, a wife? As if the game only mattered.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,